Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, we're going to go back to the channel Casual History today. They're a channel that's very obviously inspired by Simonella Academy. This one is called Last Minute Decisions That Changed World History. As always, the link is in the description to the original content if you want to check it out or check out any of his other videos. I have done a few others in the past. I haven't watched this. I haven't even looked at the chapters to see what the decisions are, so we'll take them as they go. And I will try to allow each one to play all the way through before it moves on to the next one. Then we'll pause and talk a little bit about it. So let's go ahead and dive in.
Welcome back, my friends. Today we talk about some decisions that changed history. Oftentimes, history can be changed completely by accident, with witnesses and participants having no idea what a monumental moment they just witnessed. Sometimes last-minute decisions are the most monumental, so today we'll take a look at some of these decisions and their crazy consequences. Number 1.
So yeah, I mean, he's absolutely right about that. And think about how much of history has hinged on chance or seemingly random events or the weather or somebody being 3 inches further to the right than they otherwise would have been. I mean, there's so many instances of things like that.
A last-minute officer change doomed the Titanic. The sinking of the Titanic is one of the greatest naval tragedies in history, and also one of the most famous movies of all time. I mean, we all know the story.
How many funnels do they have on that drawing? My goodness. 2, 3, 4, 8? There were only 4.
And also, one of the most famous movies of all time. I mean, we all know the story. Big, allegedly unsinkable ship is built. The ship hits a massive iceberg and finally sinks to the bottom of the sea.
On fire?
But what decisions actually led to this catastrophe? Well, there is plenty of blame to be passed around for the massive loss of life, but the most popular theory is a last-minute decision to switch officers. Second Officer David Blair lost his position shortly before the Titanic set sail, and he forgot to hand in his key to a locker that contained binoculars for the lookout. Without any spare binoculars on hand, the crew had to watch for icebergs using only their eyes. I guess this tactic didn't work out so well. Number 2.
Yeah, I mean, a lot has been made of the fact that they didn't have binoculars, and it's certainly possible that had they been using them at the right moment and they had seen the iceberg, if the ship had maybe another 20 seconds head start on turning, maybe they do miss it completely. They order hard a starboard, which actually means they're going to turn toward the port because of the way that controls worked. That's what they would have said. And then he tells them to port around it. So that means they initially are turning the front to the left and then they swing back around to try and avoid the propellers hitting it. And they grind along the side under the water and it pokes up. Now we know it wasn't one long hole. It was a bunch of smaller holes that were poked in it. And because of the way the rivets were made, there's a lot to all of it. But yeah, with a little more time, maybe it's a different scenario because it was a very dark night and the sea was super calm, which meant that there weren't big waves splashing up against the base of the iceberg, which would have made it easier to see. So all of that was a factor in what happened.
2. A wrong turn brought on World War I.
True.
Gavrilo Princip was part of the Serbian militant group called the Black Hand that sought to destroy the rulers of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And as it turns out, Gavrilo would be the one to achieve this goal. But not without a lot of luck. On June 28, 1914, Princip and others planned to take out Archduke Ferdinand as his car paraded by. They threw a bomb under the car, but the explosion was delayed and Ferdinand escaped unharmed. Then they tried to shoot him, but the gun misfired. However, luck was on the side of the young militarist. You see, during the parade, they decided to change Ferdinand's route, but his driver somehow missed this fact. As a result, he made a wrong turn and drove right back to Gavrilo Princip. The lucky assassin took this chance and killed Archduke Ferdinand, which is now considered the spark that ignited World War I. Number 3.
It's not quite as he described. It's pretty close, though. Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie after the bombing and after the failed assassination attempt, they actually should have just gotten the heck out of there, and that would have been the end of it. But they go to visit some of the people who were injured by the bombing in the failed assassination attempt. And it's after that that they go back out, and they take a wrong turn down this one-way street and have to back out because there's not enough room to turn around. And Gavrilo Princip happens to be sitting at a cafe there, debating what he's going to do next. At that point, he's a teenager, and he's, some of these guys have tried to kill themselves, but failed, and he just figures that the whole thing is failed, and he happens to be sitting outside at the cafe right when the car goes by, and that's what ends up happening. So yeah, it definitely was a wrong turn.
3. A romantic vacation may have saved D-Day. The storming of Normandy on D-Day is perhaps the single most important moment in World War II, at least from an Allied perspective, not for the Germans, especially if they knew that their historical loss may have been caused by a surprise birthday party. I know it sounds strange, but let me explain. The Nazi general might have been brutal, but he had a soft spot for his wife, causing him to plan a surprise birthday vacation for her. Coincidentally, this caused him to leave his post for a few days, right before the Allies attacked. No one can predict history, but had the most skilled German military tactician been present, things could have turned out differently. Without him, the Nazi troops were unable to gauge weather conditions, and the Allies took advantage of this fact.
It might be a minor thing, but I do take exception to describing Rommel. That's who he's talking about, is Erwin Rommel, who was celebrating his wife's birthday. And it's important to note too that Rommel was not the overall commander of German forces in the on the Western Front there, but he was obviously considered one of their best, and would have been present and might have made a difference. He was not a Nazi, though. I mean, we describe Germany as Nazi Germany sometimes, so I guess maybe I'm making too much of that. But anyway, the other thing I'll take exception with is him saying it was the most important thing to happen in World War II. D-Day did not change the outcome of the war in Europe. At that point, by June of 1944, the Germans were going to lose, even without a successful invasion of Normandy. What Normandy really determined was the post-war world. It had a big impact on how that all broke down. So it was super important in terms of the post-war scenarios. It was important for the Allies to make inroads on the Western Front and make their way to Germany so that they were meeting with the Soviets in Germany rather than the Soviets overrunning the entire country themselves, which they eventually probably would have done. So I wouldn't call it the single most important thing to happen in the war, but certainly very, very important.
4. Stanislav Petrov single-handedly saved the world from nuclear warfare.
Yeah, this is true.
If there is one man every human owes their life to, it's Stanislav Petrov. On September 26, 1983, Petrov was working at his job monitoring the Soviets' early warning systems. Several sensors went off, indicating the US had launched missiles toward the Soviets, which meant it was Petrov's job to begin returning fire. Sensing something was amiss, he quickly decided to delay telling his superiors, knowing the awful repercussions for the world if he did. This last-minute decision saved not just his country, but also the world, since this was indeed a false alarm. If not for Petrov, a nuclear battle would almost certainly have erupted between the US and the Soviet Union, and it would have devastated humankind.
So, obviously, like any story, it's more complicated than what can be described in 30 seconds or a minute, but the gist of that is absolutely true, and that's not the only time anything like that happened, but that just goes to show you how often world events are determined by people that we never hear about, by people whose names we will never know, who had just an enormous impact on the future after that, and how often small decisions that seemingly get made in the moment can completely change the trajectory of history or even in our personal lives. Same thing.
5. Clouds saved Kokura from a nuclear attack. We continue with the topic of atomic bombs. Everyone who has knowledge about World War II or recently watched Oppenheimer in cinema knows that the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not planned in incredible detail. Besides intense arguments about whether or not to use atomic bombs, they also weren't sure where to drop the bombs. The original plan was for Kokura to be hit right after Hiroshima, but a young crewman named Kermit Behan determined it was too cloudy to see all of Kokura, so he called it off. This last-minute decision saved every person in Kokura. However, when it comes to Nagasaki, they really got fucked by the weather that day. Number 6.
So, yeah, Nagasaki was the backup target. They basically, what happened was they sent a plane ahead of the plane carrying the bomb, and that plane was supposed to get to the target first and determine whether or not the conditions were adequate for the target to be hit. And in this case, they determined that Nagasaki, the cloud cover was such that they wouldn't be able to accurately assess, number one, whether they were dropping on the right spot, but also the damage that happened in the aftermath. And so they did. They moved on to the secondary target, which was Nagasaki. But this was always the plan with these bombing missions, not just with the atomic bomb, but in general, is that you planned these out and you had a certain way you did things, and you had basically a plan for what happened if you couldn't see the target. If you've watched Masters of the Air, you see a situation where on their first bombing mission that they go on in the show, they can't see the target, and so they abort the mission. They don't drop the bombs because they can't see what they're dropping on.
Marie Antoinette's last-minute decisions doomed her family. Marie Antoinette was famously beheaded during the French Revolution, and the backstory of her death definitely doesn't put her in a good light. She and her family could have totally avoided death if it wasn't for some stupid decisions by Marie. All the royals were set to flee in an ordinary carriage, but Marie insisted on the fancier model, which was slower and way more flashy. But no, this had nothing to do with an obsession with luxury. In fact, Marie did not want to be separated from her family, which would have happened if they had taken two of the smaller, faster carriages. Sweet move to stick with your family, but only until all of you get your heads chopped off for it.
Well, not all of you, but she and her husband. But yeah, they were actually almost out of the country. I've been to the little town in eastern France, which is actually right on the Meuse-Argonne battlefield of World War I. That's why I was in the town, was to see the memorial to, I think, the 35th Division or the 28th Division from Pennsylvania from World War I. Beautiful memorial. And it's in the same town where Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI were captured. They were stopped and they were recognized and arrested, but they were so close to getting out of the country.
Number 7. Hannibal caused an avalanche that killed his army.
Not all of
Hannibal
it.
was a famed Carthaginian military leader who was an antagonist of the Roman Empire. He's most famous for leading combat elephants over the Pyrenees and Alps into Rome. In the end, he failed to conquer the Roman Empire, but he may not have failed if it wasn't for a single poke he made with his cane. You see, while crossing the Alps, Hannibal's army encountered a large snowfall, which slowed them right down. Then he tried to prove that the ground they traveled on was still solid, a fatal mistake. Hannibal struck a large snowdrift with his walking cane, which caused an avalanche, which then took out a large portion of his army. Who knows, maybe if it wasn't for that rash decision, the history of the Roman Empire might have been changed forever.
I don't know if that avalanche changed the outcome, because he came through the Alps and won a bunch of victories before eventually being ultimately defeated. And we're talking about that with the oversimplified videos. We took a look at that, but I don't know enough of the details of this particular avalanche to be able to comment on it one way or the other. So some of you who know more about that part of history, let me know in the comment section below. What do you think about it?
Number 8. Johann Rall lost the American Revolution over a poker game.
I know about
Johann
that.
Rall is a lesser-known German colonel who commanded the Hessian troops that aided the British in the American Revolution. He is most famous for being the victim of George Washington's near-mythic crossing of the Delaware. Intelligence agents actually found out about Washington's plan the night before and handed Colonel Rall a note about it. However, the colonel was busy playing chess or poker, according to some accounts. Rall decided to stuff the note in his pocket and leave it for later, but there was no later for him, because he and his entire unit died in the ensuing battle.
All right, I get that he's oversimplifying these events, but just a couple of clarifications. He and his entire unit did not die. He did die. He was mortally wounded, and he was not in command of all Hessian forces aiding the British. He was in command of the detachment of Hessians at Trenton. In this case, it was a brigade-sized force, yeah, did he not do enough to protect against this attack? Absolutely. They were not drunk. They were not all hungover from partying all night the night before, and they actually put up a pretty decent defense. He was able to organize his men to a degree. The majority of the Hessians who became casualties that day were actually captured, not killed or wounded. But the amazing part about that story is that the Americans didn't lose a single man killed in action in that battle. They lost a couple to the weather, but not a single man killed in action. The closest they came was a severely wounded Lieutenant James Monroe, whose life was saved by a doctor, or else he would have been the only fatality from the battle. And he, of course, goes on to become president.
Number 9. Teddy Roosevelt was saved by a piece of paper. To be precise, he was saved by his own very long speech, which he had written down. In 1912, while making another run at the presidency as the leader of a new political party, Roosevelt had prepared a 50-page speech. Before heading there, Roosevelt randomly decided to fold up the speech and place it in his breast pocket. A last-minute decision that soon saved his life.
I don't know if it was random.
During the event, an assailant shot Roosevelt in the chest, but the bullet was greatly slowed by the massive hunk of paper in his pocket. Number 10.
Wasn't during the event. I believe he was still on his way to the event when he was shot. And the bullet did end up in his chest, but it was slowed down by the paper. And he gave the speech. And he actually got up there in Theodore Roosevelt fashion. He said, "I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but I've just been shot." And then proceeded to give the speech. And the bullet stayed in his chest for the rest of his life, which was only another 7 years. But it's such a quintessentially typical Theodore Roosevelt story that happened.
10. Martin Luther King improvised "I Have a Dream." If there's one historical quote that everyone knows, it's "I have a dream." However, originally, there wasn't meant to be any mention of dreaming. King had an entire speech written and prepared, but when Mahalia Jackson, a gospel singer in the audience, shouted, "Tell him about the dream," King started to improvise. He began speaking from the heart and disregarded his prepared speech. The result of that last-minute decision was probably one of the most famous quotes and political speeches in history.
So again, I'm not familiar with the details of that, but if that's true, that's really fascinating. And sometimes, sometimes the most eloquent moments for a political figure or a religious figure or a figure of any kind in history is something that's off the cuff and spoken from the heart. I think one of George W. Bush's finest moments in terms of public speaking was what he said off the cuff at Ground Zero a couple days after 9/11, and that was not prepared. And he was not known for being an eloquent speaker anyway. So that's just one example I can think of from the last 20 or 30 years, but there are plenty of examples like that. But pretty fascinating stuff. So let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. Like I said, the link is in the description if you want to check out the channel and see some of his other stuff without my commentary. Thanks for watching.